Hi, everybody. Is this clear? Okay, so Catherine just provided actually a great image and contrast to the way I'm going to start my presentation, which is with another humanitarian actor. Maybe just to preface what I'm going to say, just say that unlike many of the speakers or most of the speakers today, I did not have, prior to the influx of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, experience researching Syrian refugees. So I do not come to the topic from a background of refugee studies. And when in December 2013, I received a call and was asked to attend a meeting where members of international organizations who were working in Lebanon were interested in my work as a planner who does housing for low-income people. I went to the meeting really not knowing what to expect. And I still vividly recall someone we'll call Eric, because we don't want to say his name. IRB doesn't let us. So Eric was really very frustrated because the Lebanese government was not letting him set up camps. He had an extensive experience setting up camps in Africa for refugees. He knew very well how to do site planning. It works. And in Lebanon, the Lebanese government, just like the Jordanian, was stubbornly refusing to set up camps. They had bad experiences with the Palestinians, and they were not ready to start it again. And for him and for many people on his team in the weeks to come, it became clear that it was a math exercise. As the refugee number was entering the million, and remember, Lebanon is a country of 4 million, they didn't know how to house all these people. And the statement that kept coming back is, we have about 1 million refugees. Many are still not registered. We have a household size of about 6. So if you divide the numbers, we need about 180,000 housing units. Help me do them. And every time I said something else, it was like we went back to the numbers. And for me, as a Lebanese, first as someone who was very interested in the history of Beirut and its informal settlements, the first thing I can say is that I knew that Beirut's history was just a history of, even before there was a Lebanon, a history of a city that had welcomed and grown and was actually built by refugees. So I didn't feel that it was so exceptional or unusual or the end of the world. Yes, this time the number was extremely high. It wasn't the first time. But it was something that was not so unusual. The second thing is that the more I tried to sort of understand things, I realized that the absence of a housing policy in the country, of an affordable housing policy, which is what we say every day in Lebanon, was very much what these refugees were also facing. And third, I realized that sort of what would my reaction be if I was asked to house these refugees? And my answer was spontaneously during that meeting, listen, maybe there are 1 million refugees, but they're not sleeping on our streets. So where are they? Where are they sleeping? And he was like, I don't know, but we don't know where there's something we need to do. So there was constantly this different position between me and him. And I think this comes also from my own training as a planner. So as a planner, I'm trained to think that I need to see what people are doing, and if anything, try to make it better for them. So I wanted to, and working in informal settlements in Beirut for a decade and a half, I knew that there were many migrant workers, Syrian migrant workers, who were in these informal settlements. Also knowing the importance of social networks, and my own research echoes a lot of what was said this morning, knowing the importance of social networks in how people secure housing, it seemed like we really needed to go to the informal settlements and know where people were staying. So in my presentation today, I want to start with the assumption that what we're dealing with is something which is not like a humanitarian crisis, a moment, but actually a long-term story. Now we know it's been 5 years, and I begin with the assumption that I'm going to accept that forced population displacement is something that is happening normally in our city and is part and parcel of its making. By saying that, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying that it's okay or that what's happening in Syria is not a war. It's a war. There's a lot of research needs to be done on who's giving weapons to who, not only who's giving aid to who, and why is the war going on, what kind of political economy is doing it. So I do not want to depoliticize the refugee issue. For me, it's really important to say that. But having said that, I'm going to say that it's normal for me as a planner. That's what I can address. And the second thing is, and it really was interesting to me, but it seems like I think that this conversation has been happening in refugee studies for a while. Just like everyone else around the world, it's just, just like everyone else around the world is shifting towards cities, refugees are also moving to cities. So this process of urbanization is something which is expected. And I think that once we accept these premises, we need to ask ourselves, well, if all of this is happening, why is planning not, this is not working. So why is planning and why are planners not interested in the issues of refugees? Why are we as a discipline not writing about that topic? And I think that there's something about planning which is that first, it's very much a topic that where theorization is led from the global north. And in that sense, only now in this last conference of ACSP, which is our yearly conference, was everyone so interested suddenly in refugees because the flows of refugees arrived to Europe. So suddenly they really wanted to have events about it and they wanted to know how to think about it. The second issue, which is also a disciplinary issue in planning, is that we always think that the future is knowable and we can organize it really well. And thinking about refugees in crisis is really accepting a very high level of uncertainty, which I think also in the last decade, the planning discipline has begun to accept. So in this context, I think that two concepts that are increasingly circulating in the field, but not in relation to refugees, can be very useful. Both of them are extremely problematic. They can mean a lot or nothing. The first is informality, and the second is resilience. So I'm aware of the difficulty in defining, accepting, and overusing these terms. But at the same time, I think that if you look at how they're being used in planning, they actually respond to a need of accepting the uncertainty of the future. And in trying to think of our roles more modestly, in trying to influence the process of the future rather than controlling it or predicting it. And I think this is really important. So with this in mind, and sort of trying to contrast how typically humanitarian organizations work and how I would work as a planner, I'm going to take you back to Beirut, or Lebanon, where, as you can see on the map, we haven't shown this map yet today, we have 1,187,000 registered refugees. The number is too low. Since May 2015, the Lebanese government does not allow UNHCR to register refugees, so we know that the number is higher. Also, if you know what the population of Lebanon is, you should know that about 1 out of 4 people today in Lebanon is a refugee. So the 1.5 million refugees make about a quarter of the Lebanese population. So I've said all of this without going through my slide. So the first question is, if you accept my framework of where do refugees go, you look at this picture, and I think the answer is there. They're everywhere. They're all over the country. They're in rural areas. They're in urban areas. And so so what we try to do is to look at, so what kind of housing accommodations do they find? And when you look at that, you see that the largest percentage of these refugees are in houses. And actually, a smaller section that receives a lot of attention is in tents. The last figures tell us that less than 10% are actually in what the UNHCR calls ITSs, informal tented settlements. So this is, for example, an example of an ITS. And when we look at this, we're sort of comforted in our image that, so this is a camp, it looks like where refugees should be, and it responds to the classic scheme. Except when you look at how this is actually produced, you figure out that this is an individual who owns a piece of land that maybe until 2012 he used to plant. And then he got an opportunity to rent out some space for refugees so that they can set up a camp. And one day, 2 or 3 families began to scramble as they paid him $50 a month to get the space. And what's fascinating is that then one of the international organizations that's driving by says, oh, this is a camp, let's help them. So they come without talking to the municipality or anybody. They dump wood sticks and some plastic sheets. And within a few months, this looks like a camp. And it sort of works like a camp, so it helps everyone. The UN can actually located on the map like this, GIS it, know who's in charge of it, and so we're moving in the current scheme. But if we accept the fact, but if we think about the fact that this is rented, then we begin to think that there's a process of a market which is in place. And there I go back to my planning framework and informality, because then my planning methods are really useful. They tell me that in the discipline of planning, we for a very long time thought that we were going to build houses for low-income people. We were going to do public housing, and it was going to be great all over the third world. And then somewhere in the early 70s, especially after Habitat 1, we accepted the fact that self-help housing was going to be the way many low-income people were going to get their houses. Now, notwithstanding the fact that politically this is problematic, we still know that this is the way cities are growing. And I think there's a very strong parallel between that conversation and the conversation we're seeing now with refugees and how they find their houses. So how have people evolved in thinking about informal housing? How do we intervene there? Well, after 40, 50 years of debate, planners have come to the acceptance that we need to support people, and that if this has become a market, we need to understand how this market works. What kind of institutions support it? Who sells? Who buys? What kind of housing product? How does it change over time? Is it getting better? Is it getting consolidated? Or is it getting worse? So very much with that framework, I went to the neighborhood in Beirut where I knew there was a very large rental housing stock and where I expected that there would be a lot of Syrian refugees. And with a quick count, we found that so the methodology was very much adopted from how people look at informal settlements and processes of market exchanges. And here you can see, so we did a quick count to see who was there. We did in-depth interviews with refugees, but also with people who were renting them houses. And we repeated the quick count this last October just to see how things were moving. The findings back in October 2014, and this was part of a work that was done for UN Habitat and UNHCR, was that 70% of the 317 housing units we randomly selected were actually rented by Syrian refugees. Of those units, counting the fact that Syrian households are at least double the size of Lebanese households, we came to the figure that 80% of the neighborhood dwellers had become Syrian refugees since the beginning of the crisis. I don't have enough time to go into how things were happening, but I will just say that for me, it was the first answer. I went back to UNHCR saying, you want a camp? I have one for you. Come with me. How are the shelter conditions? Well, they're not good. There's a lot of overcrowding. At that time, there was up to 14 individuals per room. The apartments were poor. Some had structural cracks. Very few had any direct sunlight or ventilation. The urban infrastructure was crumbling. Of course, Beirut, before the refugee crisis, didn't have 24-hour electricity, but things were getting worse. We were getting water shortages. That particular winter, there was not much rain the year before, and so the situation was terrible. The worst part was that the situation was getting worse. It wasn't getting better. And for people who work in informal settlements, we know that that's when you see the red flag. You can't just say that's fine. You actually have to come up with something. Shelter security was very high on the mind of UNHCR agents, and they wanted to know whether there were evictions and how we could prevent them. So we tried to also look into that, and surely it was a top issue on people's minds. But what they were thinking about is that they were renting, so if the money stops flowing, if they couldn't find someone to lend them money, if they couldn't find a job, then they would be on the street. So then the next question is, so how did you find your houses? No, sorry, that's a little bit of a different structure, okay. The next question was, what was happening in the neighborhood? So how were things changing in the neighborhood? Who was lending them the houses? And here is where we began to see things that were even more concerning. The first thing is that we were seeing that many landlords were preferring to leave. When you have such a high demand, the prices are skyrocketing. And we were hearing things from the realtors in the neighborhood like, we've never seen prices go up so fast. This is great. It's a great economic opportunity. That means that the realtors are going to go to Lebanese households who live in the neighborhood, and tell them, we prefer that if you want to leave, you can rent with the same money something much better, and we can subdivide your house into 3 houses, and then you can get more money, actually. So it's a win-win situation. So the Lebanese families were moving out. The Lebanese families were, those who were renting were being pressured to leave because now the realtors could get higher money from it. And what was also very interesting is that a process of slumlording was happening. So a few people were actually beginning to control a very large stock. The largest among them, who was obviously very strongly politically supported, was holding up, I think the last time we talked to him, 82 buildings in the neighborhood. So very high number, and definitely gains credibility over time because he has the power to evict those who cannot pay rent. So if you're a landlord, and Syrian families knew across the board they preferred to rent from a landlord than from a realtor because the family would feel for them if they couldn't pay at the end of the month. But over time, as the landlords were also losing their jobs and were getting increasingly in need of money, their favorite thing was to leave and let the realtor collect the money because he was stronger. On the side of the refugees, yes, social networks were extremely important. So families learned how to access housing through the networks. It was workers, essentially, who used to be in the neighborhoods that had first brought their families, and then other family members. In January 2014, more than 40% of the interviewed households secured their housing through a realtor. What kind of contracts did they have? So that's how we work through it in informal settlement market studies. We ask people, how do you learn about the house? So we disentangle the process of housing acquisition through its ingredients. So how do you actually learn that there's a housing opportunity? What kind of an agreement do you make? And then if things get bad, what kind of backing do you actually have? How do you support yourself? So if the realtor came and says you have to leave, do you have a backing? What kind of negotiation do you have? If he breaks the deal, how do you protect yourself? And as you can see, contracts were very informal. Most tenants actually preferred that. They said that it was flexible. They weren't sure they wanted to stay. If they lost their jobs, they then would prefer to go to an ITS because it was cheaper. So they preferred that flexibility. And what was very interesting is that even evictions were very much within the framework of the market. And by that I mean that people did not evict people because they didn't like them or because they were Syrian. They evicted them because they weren't paying the rent. So. The neighborhood itself was quickly deteriorating. I don't have the time to go through all of that, but I will just say a couple of things. There was a very important plus for many families, which is the fact that this is a neighborhood that had many single male workers, and suddenly it has families. So a lot of the women who were staying in the neighborhood said, we like it more, there's less street fights now, and there's more children on the street, that's better. On the downside of things, there was so much money that could be wrapped from the neighborhoods that we were witnessing people who were interested in buying a whole building in the neighborhood because that became a good financial investment. So if you place the neighborhood on its trajectory, it was definitely, there was pluses and minuses, and you had to intervene in a way that's very reminiscent of what UN Habitat has been arguing for since the early 70s, which is that you need to come in with an urban development strategy. This is something that scholars in the field of refugee studies are also converging to. So it's interesting to see that there was a very needed conversation across the disciplines. I don't have enough time, unfortunately, to go through all of that. So I'll just close by saying that for me, because I wanted to take back this conversation to planning as well and to think about what planners should do, I think that planning has an immense capability of actually informing the current refugee crisis. That the discipline has accepted the way in which cities are makeshift, that they're imperfect, and that it's been dealing with this and with a very high level of uncertainty. So there's a lot of lessons from planning experiences that can be derived. I think the most important ones have to do with how we learn about things and the humility that planners have acquired over the last 2 decades. We're not saving anymore the world. We're making small strategic interventions that makes people's lives a little bit better. And I think that through both the frameworks of learning and those kinds of interventions, there's a lot of potential for things to get better. Thank you.
So can you come here for discussion? Okay. Well, thank you very much for these very exciting papers. Just before opening the floor for discussion, I have just a few comments I would like to make, just because I had the chance to read the paper. Okay, so the two papers seems to be grounded in different disciplinary perspectives, right? One is grounded in planning, the other one is more grounded in an ethics and practice of humanitarianism on one hand and on humanitarian practitioners on the other. Um, but, but overall, they expose some of the shortcomings of humanitarian thinking and intervention, and in different ways, they repropose a sort of revisitation of this, right, of the humanitarian paradigm in a way. So there are some common themes here which I see. So the first one has to do with time and with the emergential character and short-term view of intervention, which, as Catherine was arguing, ends up decontextualizing and desituating people. So, I mean, in this context, it seems that global humanitarian discourses seems to, reiterating a sort of an abstraction, right? An abstraction from the local context and a trend to apply universal principles to socially, spatially, economically, politically different situations. So this is a common critique. There is also another common sort of argument you're making here, is that there is a representation of refugees as passive victims, as basically as objects of intervention rather than actors of positive social change. So I see here that the approaches have the merit of recalibrating, the debates and focusing on, therefore, on refugees in the case of Professor Fawaz and on the humanitarian practitioners in the case of Catherine Byrne. So just a couple of comments I was thinking about. And this has to do especially with the paper on Professor Fawaz on informality and resilience. So it's like you are trying to think about a new way also of planning, right? Because it seems that you are trying to develop an approach which is about learning and planning from below, so to speak. Or at least learning from those everyday practices rather than just thinking about these issues within an emergential scenario, right? But I mean, my kind of contribution in theoretical terms is this, and it's like you could even stretch it further than what you did in terms of I think that the concept of informality and resilience, though quite complicated, but they are useful for you because they can be read as vehicles of a sort of subaltern urbanism, right? To say it with Gramsci, by which I mean basically a series of everyday social practices which respond to the failures of governmentality. Somebody before was talking about how refugee strategies are very much about how to evade governmentality, how to respond to this. So a couple of questions beyond the comments. Besides recognizing the merit of having given us a different representation of Syrian refugees, which in these countries are always connected to very negative connotations, right? Syrian refugee stealing resources, stealing labor, stealing everything. So I think you have kind of brought things upside down. So thank you for this. So, but I have kind of two sort of criticisms, so to speak, which actually you recognize some of these things in your talk and in the paper. And so, though I appreciate, I've been working a lot now in the African context where informality is the norm rather than, an exception. And like the focus on informality and migrant social networks generally tend to leave aside tensions or contradictions which have to do with how these informal practices also tend to reproduce, again, inequality, power relations. In the housing sector particularly, there is the question of tenure of security, which is the same as land in the rural context. Abusive power of political parties, of what you were calling slumlordism, something like that, yeah, or landlordism, whatever. So these are key questions. So the question is, how do we make resilience, I mean, concept like resilience and informality more responsive to, to this kind of, social realities, which then end up shaping, urban spaces, right? So this is one, because again, power relation inhabit the informal. They're not just outside of it. And then the second question has to do with how do we think the formation or the production of urban space. And so allow me here to, a brief digression. I mean, I come from agrarian or rural studies, and I recognize that there is often a sort of compartmentalization in the way we think about urban and rural space. Right? And actually, I mean, if we adopt the perspective you are talking about, which is looking at the actual subject, we end up with a much more liquid understanding of spaces rather than divided, right? So I'm kind of not surprised because I expected, but I'm kind of perplexed of the fact that that we don't think about how planning and interventions, especially because you were saying that refugees are everywhere. Yeah, I'm perplexed of the fact that we are not thinking about these urban-rural articulations, right? About how do we, I mean, the countryside is, I mean, the way in which we manage the countryside affects urban spaces, okay, right? So, I mean, should we try to incorporate, again, also this kind of articulation in our analysis of urban social realities? Because I'm thinking about this because the same kind of problems you identified with the humanitarian agency, I noticed the same thing with the World Food Program, which basically they are all interested in, well, in delivering vouchers to allow people to buy food, which is a noble, so to speak, issue. But again, it is very much connected to the short term and is unable to intercept those daily strategies of Syrian migrant workers, which actually have been found their own way to secure access to food in some ways, which is trying to gain access to land and through this, through their labor access to food, right? So there is here a parallel which I think it's important to recognize. And third, finally, sorry to take it long. So if you want to look at the migrant social networks as an important unit of analysis, so to speak, or as a domain which needs to be further investigated, well, then we need definitely to integrate this with an analysis which deals with the political economy of the region. Because, of course, as you were correctly saying, we need also to understand those factors. Of course, we know there is a war, but the more complex political economy of the region also needs space also to understand urban domains. So thank you. Sorry for this. So the floor is open. So the first floor, the first row, and then the last. Okay, you can start.
Thank you for the very interesting presentations. I have a comment and a question. My question is to Mona. In the title of your presentation, there's a concept of urban resiliency. You didn't elaborate much on it. Can you please elaborate on resiliency of whom, to whom, of what, to what? So what's the scope of resilience that you speak about in your presentation? And this links me to the comment I'm about to make, because resilience initially was a concept of being able to absorb, respond to, and manage a shock that comes, and then to be able to bounce back to the same level of the situation. But now it has evolved into a concept of betterment. So it's not enough to go to the same level of the situation that one or a system or a person or an institution was in, but to improve and to become better. And this is a concept that Catherine spoke about as well when she mentioned the humanitarian system moving from saving lives into something beyond that. I do agree with this idea, but there was something, and Leon called it a sense of utopia, in a sense that when you speak of humanitarian workers and you ask rightly a question of where do humanitarian workers come from, I would also challenge and ask a question of what are the motives of humanitarian workers. So for a country like Lebanon, we've been on-off crisis since I don't know when. NGO and aid agencies have become just another business where people can go and get their income and be able to make a living out of it. So I question who are the humanitarian workers on the forefront and on the who are doing the field work, and do all humanitarian workers come from a humanitarian mind and perspective? And my question is, what are the implications of this on the humanitarian system at large, and what can we do about it? Thank you.
Two really important papers, and I'm looking forward to see what the next phase of the research will be for both of them. I have a question for Catherine about the direction that you're taking the ethics of care idea and future research, because one of the things that's striking to me, if I think about care providers in a whole range of contexts, is how often the decision about those relationships includes strong judgments, and in particular judgments about deserving and undeserving, or judgments of, which are often based upon, is the client compliant or non-compliant? So if you look at who gets selected for resettlement, often from in a refugee context, it's more likely to be the compliant refugee or the younger refugee. If you look at care for street children, it's more likely to be the young, attractive client. So again, not how to go deeper into teasing out these issues.
Thank you. There was somebody there. So, yeah, just she, and then we're coming there. So. Okay, sorry, there is an announcement to make your question very short.
Okay.
It's not my fault.
It's gonna be very short. It's for Dr. Fawaz. Actually, I'm very pleased by your presentation because we're coming from different backgrounds, and I found the huge part of my findings in your paper. So I'm very pleased. Actually, I was working on urban stigmatization in very poor neighborhoods in Beirut, and especially Khanda El Ghami. And I found that Syrian refugees were choosing to live entre guillemets in Khanda El Ghami, using the labor network to live there, and by result they are subir another phenomenon of stigmatization by political territoriality, because we know who controlled this district. My question is, the choice of these refugees were to live in the house. House is the cœur d'îlot, it's the central of the traditional tissue. And I noticed that these houses became to be specialized. We have house for families with women, and we have house with, entre guillemets, bidon, entre plastique et tout, for labels. And on the door of each house, I don't know if it's true, but this is what I was told, the Syrians were obliged to show papers to men controlling the street, civil men. So my question is, okay, they chose to live there. How do they have their choice? And what's the role of political territoriality to how they do subir the stigma? C'est des Syriens réfugiés, politiquement stigmatisés. Et voilà, ils vont subir le stigma d'être syrien, le stigma d'être un travailleur, et le stigma, voilà. Je m'excuse, c'est en français.
Okay, so let's move here in the middle, and then we come there. Sorry, can you raise your hand because she can't find you. Okay.
Right. Okay. Sorry to jump in. I really enjoyed those presentations. Thank you very much. I think the question I had for Catherine actually echoes what was asked in front, which was in terms of thinking about who the actors are and also thinking about, beyond just the question of the business model, sort of disaggregating between those who are humanitarian actors who come from elsewhere and people who are working in the humanitarian sector within the local context, and how they see their roles and how you would sort of sort of articulate your argument based on those distinctions. Mona, I'm sure you've answered this question somewhere else, so I apologize if you have to repeat something, but one of the things that's also happening with the question of real estate and the rental market in particular is the intervention of INGOs in it, in terms of paying the rent for a year for refugee families. I think one of the things that is a challenge for planners perhaps, and again is something that I would really like you to speak to, is this thing of we have to deal with these non-state actors who are particular non-state actors in a very certain way. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how you see their impact on the rental market in Lebanon, but more generally, how would you incorporate sort of humanitarian actors and that uncertainty into the planning discipline? Thanks.
In the middle.
Hi, so my name is Male, and my question is for Catherine. I just wanted to, or maybe this is a comment/question, which is that I was wondering how, rather than mapping the biological and the biographical onto a temporal sort of scale of crisis versus protracted, I wanted to suggest or ask if it's possible to say that that the very idea that humanity is ever simply biological is already a political myth. And therefore, a political myth on which discourses of crisis are based. And if one starts from that assumption that the biographical inevitably leaks back into the biological, then it's not simply something that is discovered in the field by aid workers and something that elides managerial thinking, but actually it's an aporia that's constitutive of the very concept of humanitarianism, and something that actually you'll find even the very country directors of INGOs being deeply aware of. If one then recognizes that, then the question becomes, why is it that humanitarian reason continues to speak in the language of biology when humanitarian governmentality already works with biographies in a very deep way and has always in fact done so? Why do we continue to use the word crisis when actually every aid worker that you speak to uses the word protracted? It's that symptomatic sort of politics that cannot speak in its own name that then I think takes us to the next step with this biographical distinction. Thank you.
Sorry, to Caroline, no, you fine? So, on the...
Hi. My question is for Dr. Fawaz. So I just wanted to know, I was interested in your choice of Nebbe as an area. I live very close by, and I just wanted to know, because you said 80% of the occupants is that right? 80% of the occupants were central area. So what was it before the crisis? Because I know, living close by, I know that this area usually offers substandard housing, and it's very attractive for migrant workers and many Syrians even before the crisis. So it's really interesting. Second, because I know Nebbe and it's probably the sectarian representation in the area, I wanted to see how the influx of refugees or Syrian refugees has played along that sectarian division there, and how about the social cohesion, how it's working, because it seems like you said a lot of Lebanese families are leaving and then they're being replaced by Syrian refugee families, but at the same time you said that many locals are feeling that it's becoming safer because of the presence of children and families. So how does the social cohesion play a factor there? My last quick question is, what would be your recommendation in terms of policy for this kind of planning, for the slumlording, for the high rental fees, and for like one person managing 82 buildings? What would be the policy recommendation to handle such a crisis?
Just to hear the last question. Can you raise your hand, please?
want to thank you both for thought-provoking presentations, and my question is to Mona, and I don't want to repeat what others said because it coincides with a lot of the questions, but I would like you to think out loud with you about the issue of the role of the state and regulation, because just for a small example, in Saida, for instance, where old abandoned one-room houses in the orchards, for example, are being rented out to Syrian refugees for $200, which is sort of creating an abusive situation and reproducing vulnerabilities. So I totally agree with you with the idea of looking at informality as a way of things happening, but sometimes they happen because people don't have any other choices. So how can we think of the role of the state and regulations while acknowledging the way things are happening?
Thank you. Sorry, there is already too many. Fine. Just very brief, please. Otherwise, they will have too many questions to answer.
Just a simple question to Catherine. You talk about the biographical aspect of the refugees. The biographical aspect does include identity, right? And identity has a political dimension. And usually the political dimension is part of the conflict that creates the refugees. So how does one deal with trying to cope with the refugees in their future without going into issues of politics and conflict?
I will want to Mona, who just one question, it's very simple. Who enforces eviction?
So I'm going to be thinking about a lot of these questions as I finish this paper, and definitely I don't have enough time to answer them, but I'm just going to say a few things that I hope will clarify where I'm coming from. Perhaps I'll start with the easiest one. Who enforces eviction? It's the realtors. So I'll just tell you a quick. So in broad daylight, in the middle of the week, they don't. I mean, we were expecting that they'll wait for the night and they will wait for the weekend. They do it in broad daylight, in the middle of the week. They don't care. And when I ask the strongest among them, who gives you backing? Because I'm always been interested in that expression in Arabic, بيعطي ظهر. So I told him, مين بيعطيك ظهر? He told me, أنا الظهر. I am the back. So, so they're basically, they are strong men. They definitely have very strong networks with the local political party. Nebbe is an area that has both Lebanese forces and Hezbollah. You may think that they're against each other completely in politics, but when you look at how things work on the ground, there's lots of collaborations and cooperations, and the police force takes its cut, and that's how the world works. So there's nothing unusual about it. So I wasn't surprised. I've seen it in Hayy Salam with low-income Lebanese families. I've seen it in Shatila. I've seen it in many places, actually. So it's the way things happen. I'm very interested in this idea of how do we, where do we locate this state? Is this planning that's a new planning, that's a planning from below, a subaltern planning where we celebrate people's resilience? No, it's not. I think that if I've come to something over my recent years of thinking, it's with the fact that the state is too big of an actor and too strong of an actor to just say, let's forget about it and celebrate people's resilience. We need to think about that notion of a shared common. If we want to be planners, there's something called the shared common, that planning operates constantly with the assumption that it exists. And the assumption, which is always used, is that the shared common is supported by the state. And what we know is that when we have dysfunctional states, then we can't plan. And in my own work, what I've been thinking a lot about is what pieces of the state with what other local actors can we connect together to become supporters of the common good. If I have a municipality that's against me, but a local planning agency or some piece of a local planning agency that can work with me, how can I combine them with local activist groups, with anybody else, so that I have some kind of a system that supports the common good? And in that system, I think we have certain geometries that are very interesting that we're seeing in Lebanon emerging. So my ambition would be, if a donor was interested, is in building that for the Syrian refugees in Nebbe. And I think that that's where we really need to be thinking about how we can create some kinds of systems that can help enforce this. And that's, again, the exact same thing with notions like resilience. I mean, so now we have a big grant for the Beirut municipality to design a resilience plan for Beirut. And we know that the way they think about it is very different from the way I would think about it. Studies tell us that, just 1 minute. Studies tell us that informality is... Okay, so then I guess... Sure, okay, so that's fine. I'm sorry. We can, whoever... Okay, so we can...
Sorry for everyone. I wish I wouldn't play that role of police, but there are people waiting outside and they have too much.
Sure. Okay, so then thank you for the questions. They're useful.
Yeah. 10 minutes break, please. We fix the room and we come back. Thank you very much.